One of us went to the industrial centers of the Midwest and tried to build a kind of a forceful movement of opposition in the industrial working class. And I did what I did. Who got it right? Who ended the war? It turns out none of us ended the war. And it turns out none of us was exactly right, and none of us was completely idiotic either. So no, I don't regret opposing the war for 10 years with every ounce of my being. I regret a million things along the way, and you had asked me earlier, for example, and I would say the one thing that I regret and never want to repeat is getting into a position where I'm kind of, as I wrote about in Fugitive Days, where I'm comfortably kind of encased in the bright light of a single good idea. So that to me is dogma or ideology. And I look around the political debates in this country today, and they're driven by ideology, not by evidence, not by argument. You listen to the Republican debates, and it's like fact-free, faith-based debating at its worst. So, yeah, I regret that. I regret becoming dogmatic and ideologically driven. I don't want to do that again, but I don't regret opposing the war.
I want to bring Bill Ayers because, the premise of our organization, the Foundation for United Front, is about community building in the sense of not like within the physical sense of Springfield, but bringing people with common interests together. And that's what Bill, during his tenure, if you will, as an activist, has done. He brought people together with SDS, doing for Democratic Society. They all came for a common cause, whether it be about Vietnam, whether it be about poverty, whatever it was. He brought them all together, and that's what we're about too. So I felt it was appropriate to bring him down and have a dialogue about that. All right, without any further ado, this evening we have a person who's an academic and an activist. As an academic, he's a retired professor at the University of Illinois Chicago, where his own research interest was in urban education reform and social justice. He has edited and written many books and articles on education. As an activist, he became the director at the Children's Community School, which was part of the free school movement. I believe that was in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And he joined the picket lines in Ann Arbor, where they refused to seat African Americans in a pizzeria. And also, many of you know about his other involvements in the 1970s. But without further ado, Mr. Bill Ayers.
Thank you. Thank you, AJ, and thank you all for coming out. You can hear me okay, right? In the back? Okay. Mic check. Mic check! I love you. I love you. You're beautiful. You're beautiful. See, if you get down to the General Assembly, the first thing you want to say is what you want to hear. So, thank you. It makes you feel better.
I was interviewed by the State Journal Registry, SJR here in town, and it came out, and some people automatically assumed I was a terrorist and have very close ties with Bill Ayers. I've known him through my network of people and all that. So, yeah, people are going to have that. We're human beings. We automatically assume something. And, I'm not a terrorist. But, again, it's activist to activist having this dialogue, and as you saw here, it was very peaceful. That we had an opposition here, and Bill walked up right to him, and they had dialogue, and it was very friendly. He invited them in. Unfortunately, they got turned out. They didn't want to come in, but we had a little over 50 people here, and there was a very nice conversation in there as well.
Wait, I'm going to get a mic.
Call me Mr. Wolf. I solve problems.
Dude, he's a problem solver. All right, so this is easier. I don't have to shout. You can hear me. And whoever wants to talk next, I'll give you the mic, or you can. I'll pass it around. Okay, so we're living in a situation where, with great military power, we also have declining economic, social, and political power, and that is a very dangerous situation. And so it seems to me that all of us have a responsibility to open our eyes and struggle towards a society that's more democratic, more peaceful, more participatory, more inclusive, and that we can't predict exactly what's going to happen. But if we don't do that, then we're in trouble. I think that there's a very simple way to understand, very simple for me to remember, simple to understand but hard to enact, for what it means to be a citizen in this country, or what it means to be an activist, or even what it means to be a moral person. And it's a simple rhythm, and I take it from 3 lines from a poem by Mary Oliver. Mary Oliver says, in the middle of a longer poem, she has a little section called Instructions for Living a Life. Instructions for Living a Life, and it's very simple. She says, pay attention, be astonished, do something. So let me just unpack that briefly, and then I want to talk a bit about activism. Pay attention, be astonished, do something. Paying attention is the most difficult thing, because it's not so simple as just kind of going through life, the habits of a daily life. You have to try explicitly to open your eyes, to question everything that's before you, to wonder about what the alternatives are. I think, if you think about it, everything in front of us is just taken for granted. Let me do a little thought experiment. Y'all are against slavery, right?
Yes.
Damn. Wake up. Okay. Pay attention. I'm going to ask you a question. I want you to answer. You're against slavery, right?
Yeah.
Thank God. Okay. But if we were living in 1840 and you were against slavery, you'd have been against the Constitution, the founders, the law, both of your senators, your congressmen, the state legislature, the Bible, your preacher, the parents, tradition. Everything would have told you you're out of your mind. And that's why, Mark Twain wrote a wonderful, wonderful little essay called Free Speech is for the Grave. And it's one of those funny Mark Twain kind of bits where he goes on and on about how nobody wants to be ill thought of, and therefore somebody says, how are you? You say, fine. And, because you don't want, you don't want to tell the truth because it's just upsetting. So everyone goes along and goes along. And the killing example that Twain gives is slavery. He says, I don't know anyone who's for it. I don't know anyone who speaks up against it. I don't know anyone who's for it, but I don't know anyone who speaks up against it. Now, we, of course, in this room, let's give ourselves a pat on the back. We'd have all been with Harriet Tubman, with Frederick Douglass, with John Brown. We're all killer abolitionists, right? That's what we are, because, damn it, we know that now. Let me ask you another question. You're for a woman's right to vote, right?
Right.
Not just the women. When I say that, I want men to say something. Yes, we're for a woman's right to vote, right? Yes. Okay, good. Okay, but if you were for a woman's right to vote 100 years ago, you'd have been against the Constitution, the founders, the law, your senators, the congressmen, your parents, the Bible, and your preacher. Would you have done it? Let's give ourselves a break and say, yes, we would have done it. But the reason I bring those 2 examples to the fore is because those are settled for us. For folks like us. Those are done. We don't need to question those. But that doesn't help us know who we are today. Because if we open our eyes today and look at the world around us, we have to ask, what are we missing? What are we taking for granted just because it's common sense? And there's nothing more dogmatic and insistent than common sense. It's the most dogmatic thing we have. So homelessness, what are you going to do? Homeless families, what can you do about it? This is the problem that we face, that we don't see in front of us what's going on. So let's think forward a minute. Let's imagine 40 years from now, your granddaughter says to you, is it true that when the first African-American president was elected, it cost him $500 million to become president? And you'll say, I don't remember that. Really? Yes, $500 million the first time and $1 billion the second time. And you say, well, I think he raised it on the internet, and your granddaughter will say, you're an idiot. So, I don't know that that'll happen, but I'm just projecting, maybe. But the point is, we take for granted, don't we, that money and politics it's all part of the game. Corporations are people, although, my favorite magazine, Adbusters, which I've subscribed to for a decade, they have a wonderful page in there which says, I'll believe corporations are people when Texas executes one. I thought that was kind of good. Okay, the corruption of money in politics goes back to the beginning. We've seen it all of our lives, right? But nothing is more bizarre than the upcoming election, which will be billions and billions of dollars spilled on buying an election. And what makes us different then than any other kind of what you might have called once a banana republic. It's bought, it's sold, democracy for sale. That's an example, and I'm not saying it's your example or the best example, but it's an example of what we might be missing today because we breathe in the common sense. We breathe in the common sense of everything that is before us, and we don't open our eyes and ask questions. Here's another question your granddaughter might ask you. Is it true that when you were a student at University of Illinois Springfield, that there were 2.5 million of your fellow citizens in prison? 2.5 million. In fact, there was a part of the national gulag was only 15 miles from your campus. When I tell my students, 1 mile from our campus, 15,000 black men are living in cages. And they're like, really? Yes, really. 2.5 million people, more than any other country per capita. An absolute caging industry, or what Michelle Alexander calls the new Jim Crow, mass incarceration as a political tool. And we're living in that. And your granddaughter, depending on how things turn out, might say to you, didn't you know that? And you say, well, I kind of knew, but nobody knew what to do about it. There are things to do about it. But you first have to open your eyes and accept that the world you're looking at on the surface is not the whole picture. You have to go deeper. And in an infinite and expanding universe, you can never know everything. You have to keep opening your eyes. Every day you have to get up and question what's before you and ask yourself, what else? Parentheses. There's no way to be a moral person if you don't start with what you see before you. Quick example. There's a wonderful film from a decade ago that won the Best Foreign Film at the Academy Awards called Central Station. Have any of you seen it from Brazil? It takes place in the Central Station of Rio de Janeiro. A retired teacher sits at a little table like Bernie's sitting at and writes letters. That's what Bernie's doing right now. Writes letters for illiterate people. And she makes a few coins on the side, writing letters for the illiterate. Okay? And one day a guy comes to her in the very beginning of the film, a guy who she recognizes from the daily routine of the Central Station, comes to her and says, Dora, I'd like you to do a job for me, and I'll pay you $100 if you take the day off tomorrow and do this work for me. What's the job? He asks her to pick up a 10-year-old boy in one part of Rio de Janeiro and escort him across the city and deliver him to another address where, he says, a rich American couple will adopt the boy and take him to the United States. Well, hell, that's a pretty good deal. $100, that's more than she makes in a month. So she says, sure. Next day, she goes to the address, picks up the boy, makes her way across Rio, which is a complicated city like LA. It's not like getting across Springfield. And delivers the boy to the address. She gets her $100, and on the way home, she buys a television, goes back to her very modest apartment, and is watching TV when the neighbors come over. And the neighbors ask her how she got the TV, and she relays the story of the boy and the $100. And the neighbors say, Dora, are you that stupid? Are you that ignorant? Don't you read the papers? She says, what do you mean? They say, Dora, that boy wasn't adopted. No one adopts a 10-year-old. A baby is adopted, but not a 10-year-old. That boy's been sold on the international market. His organs have probably already been harvested. He's already been killed. And that's what you participated in. Well, this all happens in the first half hour of the movie. And of course, she's horrified, and so are we. As a Western audience, we want her to do what she in fact does do, which is she retraces her steps in an attempt to save the boy's life. Wouldn't you expect her to do that? Once her eyes were opened, she had to act. Before her eyes were opened, she didn't have to do anything. It was just a simple business problem. But once she knew what the terms were, she had to act. And as I see that film, as I've watched it many times, I think it's a metaphor or an allegory for us. What do we not see? What do we not want to see? What are we transacting that we don't want to know what's underneath it? Because it would require us to act. I'm suddenly thinking of my beloved mother, who was a wealthy suburban woman outside Chicago, and she passed away many years ago. But about 25 years ago, I was taking care of her. She had broken her ankle, and I was out taking care of her, and it was a drought year, and she asked me somewhat innocently, she said, what's this thing I've heard about called global warming? And I decided to I gave her a very mild explanation. I didn't want to scare the shit out of her, and but I wanted her. She asked, so I told her. After I told her, she looked at me very cold and very kind of unhappy, and she said, "I'm sorry I asked." Well, exactly. Because if you ask, you might hear. And if you hear, you might have to do something. In her little world, the lawns were always watered. The swimming pool was always full. So what does she want to hear about global warming, right? Well, that's the situation of all of us. What are we not seeing? What are we not paying attention to? What are we not attending to? That's the first requirement of living, the life of an active citizen, of a participating citizen. You must pay attention. And then, Mary Oliver says, be astonished. And being astonished, it seems to me, has two qualities. One is be overjoyed at everything that you see before you. Be overjoyed and ecstatic about the beauty of the world, about the wonder of it all, about all of our relationships. It's exciting, so be ecstatic. But also be astonished at the unnecessary suffering, the undeserved harm, the harm that we visit upon one another. And be pissed off about that. Don't take it for granted. Be unhappy about it. Be astonished about it. And you have to be astonished every day. One of the problems we have when we become a little bit aware is we allow ourselves to become cynical. What are you going to do? Cynicism is a weapon of the powerful. It's a weapon of the powerful. So when we see something like Mitt Romney's 13% tax rate, we should be pissed off. Not say, rich people always do that. Be pissed off all over again. Be pissed off at a new time. Be freshly pissed off. And that's because otherwise you sink into a kind of cynicism, which is a form of despair and a form of inaction. So be astonished. And then, number 3, do something. You have to act on whatever the known demands of you. You have to do something. You have to act. And in acting, I would add a 4th to Mary Oliver, and this gets to the criticism perhaps of the Weather Underground. And maybe to the question of regret. You have to doubt. After you act, you have to doubt. And you have to say to yourself, was it all that good? Did we do what we should have done? Did we make mistakes? You have to question whether what you did was really that good, or you become dogmatic. You know what I mean by dogmatic? Perfect example is Monty Python and The Life of Brian. If you don't know it, go Google it. The Life of Brian is one of their funny movies about a reluctant Messiah. And the Messiah is up on a rampart in some Middle Eastern city, and he's yelling down to the masses below. And he says, "I'm not the Messiah." And they say, "You're not the Messiah." And he says, no, you have minds of your own. And they all say, "We have minds of our own." And at that point, one of the guys in the crowd says, "It's funny, I don't feel like I have a mind of my own." And everybody around him hits him and says, "Shut up, you have a mind of your own." Okay, that's the world we live in. That's the world we live in, where, the common sense takes over. And so I've talked to a bunch of reporters today and others, and one of the questions that people inevitably ask is, what do you think about Iran having a nuclear weapon? And I'm like, damn, is that an original thought of yours, or are you being led around by the nose, I mean, really, you could map how stupid, everything is if you just see how we turn our attention here. I remember my mother, again, who knew we were peace activists. I was very close to my mother, lovely person. But she knew we were peace activists, and during the first Gulf War, she said to me, again, kind of innocently, "I know you kids are against war, but don't you think Saddam Hussein is insane?" I'm like, damn, Mom, did you do an independent analysis to come to that, or did George Bush tell you that, I mean, in other words, what does it mean to have a mind of your own and then act and then doubt and not get caught up? One other quick example of dogma, which just popped into my mind. I'm an educator, and when I was first in Chicago, one of my wife's colleagues, my wife is a law professor, one of her colleagues asked me to look at a Montessori school, which she was thinking of sending her kids to. So I went with her and looked at the Montessori school. It was a lovely school. She sent her kids, big deal. But the whole time we were on the tour, the head of the Montessori school kept saying to us, "Now Maria Montessori, the founder of the Montessori movement, would say the children are doing X. Maria Montessori would say the children are doing X. Maria Montessori, Maria Montessori." And I felt like I was being, kind of hypnotized by the muzak of that line. Maria Montessori says. So at the break, we were having a snack. I said to my friend, "Don't drink the Kool-Aid," and the parents were having a conversation about Carl Rogers and Carl Jung, the two humanist psychologists. And apropos of that conversation, I said, Jung once said, "I'm glad I'm Jung and not a Jungian, because I can still change my mind." To which the Montessori woman said, "Maria Montessori said the same thing, and I wanted to go jump off a bridge." Anyway, see, that's the thing. When your dogma is full up, it's too easy to just relax into stupid, kind of automatic thinking. So for people like you and people like me, it's too easy to see the dogma of the House Republicans. Too easy. Our dogma is what we should worry about. Our own set thinking, our own automatic responses. Can't you start to question yourself? Can't you wonder, have I really got it all together? So, that to me is the definition of being an engaged citizen or being an activist. It is pay attention, be astonished, act, and doubt. And then when you do your doubting, when you're doing your rethinking, there's a simple standard to keep in mind. Again, very difficult to uphold, but simple to explain. And that standard is, at the risk of being a professor of education, the standard is a pedagogical standard. And the question that you have to ask yourself when you're rethinking your actions is, did I teach and did I learn? Who did I teach? What did I learn? If you didn't teach and you didn't learn, then the action was bad. It wasn't useful. But you don't always know that in advance, but it's always a standard to hold up after the fact, to say, did I teach and did I learn? Who did I teach? What did I learn? If you're not learning and teaching, then the action was not worthwhile. Even if you felt great racing down the street in your bandana, if you didn't teach and you didn't learn, if all you did was perform, then it wasn't a worthy action. But that doesn't mean that you would know that in advance. I mean, everything I ever participated in, starting at the very beginning, people told me it wouldn't work, it won't work, it won't work. Working isn't the only standard by which we, evaluate things, but I think education is. Are we teaching? Are we learning? I often think when I think about the calculus of activism, I often think that the important thing is to follow this kind of rhythm and to ask yourself if you're teaching and learning properly, but also to remind yourself that we don't act always simply to see if we'll win. Often people say, well, why would I do it if I can't win? Well, you do it because it's how you define yourself. I was born in 1944. I was born under a nuclear cloud. I didn't choose to be born in that world, but it's my responsibility to choose who to be in light of nuclear war. You didn't choose to be born at a time of permanent war. You didn't choose to be born at a time of, gross income disparities or mass incarceration or the environmental degradation so extreme that it's absolutely killing the possibility of a future. You didn't choose to be born in that, but you do have a responsibility to choose who you are in light of that. So we have to remind ourselves as activists that standing right next to the world as it is the world as it could be or the world as it should be. And we have a responsibility to either find or tease out or imagine or invent the alternatives to the world as it is. We have to point to the world as it could be or as it should be. Rosa Luxemburg, the great German socialist, was put in jail in World War I. She was put in jail, and there's a wonderful set of letters that Rosa Luxemburg wrote from prison to her friends. And one exchange was absolutely marvelous. A friend wrote to her and said, without you out here in the leadership, things are falling apart. We can't get anything done. I don't think we're going to succeed, and on and on and on. Luxemburg wrote her friend back and said, stop whining, which is good advice always. Stop whining. Stop whining. There is no social justice fairy that's going to come along. There is no perfect time to act. There is no optimal condition. There's only the here and the now, and there's you and me. That's it. Luxemburg says to her friend, after she says, stop whining, she says, your responsibility, as always, is to be a mensch. Mensch is a Yiddish word, and Luxemburg says, I can't define it for you, But mensch means you have to love your own life enough to appreciate the sunrise and the sunset, to take care of your friends and family, to enjoy a glass of wine and a good meal with friends, to care for the young ones and the elders. But you also have to love humanity enough to put your shoulder on history's wheel when history requires it. Working out that rhythm between loving yourself and loving the world, that's what it means to be a mensch. So my advice is be a mensch, and thanks for coming.
The premise of our organization is about community building, as well as trying to train individuals, organizations, whether it be about like strategic planning, leadership development, grant writing, what have you. Like I said, bringing people together for a common interest, whether it be about homelessness here in Springfield, foreclosures here in Springfield, either city reform to some degree, government reform to some degree on a statewide level. We want to bring people together as a community. And like one of the things I've been hearing about lately is about community gardens or urban agriculture. Now, I want to bring those people to the table and seeing how we can do that to help feed the homelessness, or at least go to the farmer's market to provide for that, or provide at food fantasies, or wherever it's appropriate to do that, Homelessness, we worked with some homeless people with the Occupy. We got them off the street, and we were successful with that. So we're going to try a lot of things. We're going to hear it out, and then see where our next projects are. If you want to see that, go to www.buildingsolidarity.org to see what future events we're going to do, as well as news for ourselves as well as outside.
Let's go back to the Vietnam War, which is where I cut my teeth on this stuff. It was very clear to us that the guys who were in the Army were working class guys who were drafted into it, pressed into it. The kids who are in the military now are kids who, many of my students, they signed up because they wanted to go to college. And then suddenly, because the world changed and things fell apart, they found they had to walk through the furnace of war to get a teaching certificate. What a disaster, what a catastrophe. But I couldn't agree with you more. That's why, during the Vietnam days, one of the most telling things that turned the country against the war was when the vets came home and started telling the truth. And when they threw their medals at the White House, and when they built their own anti-war organizations, Vietnam Vets Against the War, just like the kids today are building Iran Vets Against the War. Iraq, Afghanistan Vets Against the War, soon Iran, I hope not. This is something we have to bear in mind. One of the pictures that you brought to my mind was when we had surrounded the Pentagon in 1967, and Allen Ginsberg was oming, and he was trying to levitate the Pentagon, and everybody was smoking dope. Some people were having a festival of life, and the militants were doing this and this, and the National Guard had been called out, and they had their bayonets fixed, and they were standing in a line across from us. And my girlfriend at the time, and many other people, and myself included, went up and talked to them. They couldn't talk to us. We would go up and stand right in front of them and say, I know you don't want to be here. I want to tell you who I am, and I want to invite you to join us. When the first two guys left the line and came over to our side, it was pandemonium. Because it wasn't that it was the end of the militaristic, defense of the Pentagon. What it meant was, as a metaphor, it's meant these things are possible. Let's look at the Egypt at the Arab Spring. Look at Cairo. Look at Tahrir Square. If you watched carefully, you saw a bunch of things that were remarkable. One of which was the army, after several days and weeks into it, turning to the other side. When that happened, the die was cast. The driving of Mubarak from power, which was step one of the revolution they were trying to make, had happened. So let's remember, they're not only human beings, they're mostly working class folks who are just trying to have a job and trying to get by. And they're not seeing the picture maybe the way you see it. But it doesn't mean that we don't have a one-to-one relationship and we try to reach out and organize. And frankly, it brings one other thing to mind, just to get a little bit off of this. We were talking earlier about apathy and about what needs to be done. My advice to all activists is that we not only, the rhythm that I talked about, open your eyes, be astonished, act, and doubt, but also that we display our politics publicly once a week, once a month, and that we organize. So we have to organize. That means going and talking to strangers. It means engaging in conversation. So when I think of my own activism in the 60s and 70s, which is kind of this, it happened a long time ago, and I actually am not stuck there. In fact, to me, there's nothing more irritating than a person of my generation who's looking longingly to a ship that already left the shore. Get off your ass, do something today. And that's what I always want to tell the old people. But you know, what I remember most clearly is, sure, I was arrested a bunch of times. Sure, I went to jail a bunch of times. Sure, I picketed a bunch of places. All that happened, you know, and then I did other things. But the most difficult things I did are the things that are not known, that are unsung. For example, spending 2 summers in a row in Detroit, knocking on doors in 1966 and 67 in working class neighborhoods with anti-war literature and asking people to please join our effort to end the war. And at one door, somebody would open the door and say, "You're a communist, go back to Russia." And next door, somebody would say, "My cousin was killed in Vietnam last year. Please come in. I want to talk about it. And thank you for what you're doing." It was absolutely eye-opening. You know, you learn something about the country, something about the people that you didn't know. Those things take real courage. And I think whatever else you do, talking to strangers in an organized, disciplined way, you and your friends, to pick an area and say, we're going to do that, I think is critical. And GIs are very much a part of that.
Weather Underground helped kind of open up the door to COINTELPRO and the efforts from the government to infiltrate, to disrupt. Curious what your thoughts are on the current state of affairs with NYPD, the Muslim thing there, also, you know, monitoring things online. What are some of the impediments to modern day activism?
I missed the first thing you said. Weather Underground opened up?
Well, yeah. From what I understand, is somebody broke into an FBI office and found documents,
right,
kind of exposing COINTELPRO.
Media, Pennsylvania. Right. Yeah, I mean, I think this gets back to your question too about the military. Let's remember Bradley Manning is in the military, and Bradley Manning has been being tortured for a year. And what is Bradley Manning's crime? Bradley Manning's crime is opening up. You know, we all know that we live in a 1984 world. You know that, right? I mean, 1984 has happened. So they already know you're here. They know you're here because you're carrying a cell phone or whatever. I mean, it's easy to monitor all of us. What Bradley Manning and Anonymous and WikiLeaks does, it allows us to watch them watching us. And so Anonymous, in my view, and WikiLeaks, in my view, is the people's response to being under constant surveillance. We should celebrate them. And remember, Bradley Manning himself released those documents, which, if we say the Arab Spring began in Tunisia with the burning, with that guy self-immolating himself. Well, what happened in Tunisia was the great discontent based on the release of those documents by WikiLeaks. So Bradley Manning leads to Tunisia, leads to Cairo, leads to Madison, leads to Occupy. Let's not forget Bradley Manning. Let's not forget the importance of opening these kinds of things up. And then you get the question of, what do I think of? So I think nothing but positive things about that kind of response to secrecy and repression. We're supposed to live in a democracy. Why do we take for granted that the government has to have everything behind closed doors? And then you look at the WikiLeaks files, you look through them, 98% of it is nonsense. Why did they ever, make that classified? What was the point? Why can't I see that? Because they have a mentality that says, you are the riffraff. You don't get to know. We are the sovereign. And this is a very important point for folks like us. The president, in this case President Obama, or any other president, President Bush, these people aren't the sovereign. They are not the kings. They are not your king. We are the sovereign. And they work for us. So the idea that we kind of genuflect in front of them or worry a lot about them, what do they think of this? When will they bring us peace? They won't bring us peace. They won't bring us health care. They won't bring us the things we need and demand. The only thing that brings those things to us is not the good intentions of the technocrats or the powerful. It's us ourselves. I was just hearing Bob Marley today. Liberate yourself from mental slavery. None but ourselves can free our minds. And it's up to us. So when I'm on campuses and kids say, I hope Obama ends the war, my response is always the same. What have you done today to end the war? What did you do? We're not begging power to do what it ought to do. We have to insist on doing it. And the great thing about Occupy, get me started on Occupy. One of the great things about Occupy is that it's a metaphor, that it's an invitation. It's not a point of arrival. So when I hear all these old guys my age saying, oh, they don't have a program. If they're serious, they should join the Democrat. No, they shouldn't. If they're serious, they should do exactly what they're doing, which is creating a public space where every grievance is welcome. They don't need a program. Go back and look at Mario Savio's free speech speeches. He didn't have a program. He had a zeitgeist. He had a feeling. He had a metaphor, and it swept the country. Occupy already won. Occupy already won in the sense that nobody was talking about income disparity before this. Nobody would have given a shit about Mitt Romney's taxes before this. Nobody had the language 1%, 99% before the genius of the Occupy movement. And like every movement that's ever happened, the powerful always have the same response. First you ignore it, then you ridicule it, then you try to co-opt it, and then you beat the shit out of it, and then repeat. Ignore, ridicule, co-opt, beat the shit out of it. So when Rahm Emanuel, our lovely mayor, says he'd love to talk to 3 of the Occupy people if they'd like to come to his office, and they said, you know what, come on down to the General Assembly, get in line, we'll let you speak. And that's right. That's the right response, because what makes you God of Chicago? And incidentally, if you didn't see, G8 has moved out of Chicago. Victory for us. We should claim it, because they realized, yes, exactly, because they realized that they couldn't actually put on their little performance of power without the response that Occupy represented starting in September. So they had a clever idea that they were going to showcase the world through Chicago, and Rahm Emanuel and President Obama were going to get some payoff from that. But thank goodness for us, because now they've decided they can't do it, and it's all understood that it's a defeat for them and a victory for the people's movement.
Yeah.